My guest today has made science communication her passion. In addition to studying biology and neuroscience at the University of North Texas, she's now a full-time science communicator. She's the host of the Talk Nerdy podcast, a science correspondent for the Huffington Post, an LA-area Emmy award-winning reporter for SoCal Connected. She's made appearances on Larry King, the Joe Rogan Experience, CNN, Fox News, TLC, National Geographic, and many other shows, including, most recently, Bill Nye Saves the World. And now she's here to talk about that journey and what it takes to be a science communicator.
Hey guys, Cara Santa Maria here, and you're watching Holy Kool-Aid.
Many of my subscribers are intensely passionate when it comes to science. You're a science educator, which I think is one of the coolest and most respectable jobs that anybody could have. How do you get into something like that, and what steps should my listeners follow if they'd like to take a similar path?
Science communication is a field that's growing every day. Individuals join from a wide variety of backgrounds. So a lot of people who do what I do or do work that's similar to mine came from the sciences or from other STEM fields, that's science, technology, engineering, and math. But a fair amount of them don't have any academic training in the sciences. Maybe they came from journalism or from storytelling or literature even. So there are a lot of different paths that you can take. Probably the first piece of advice that I would give to somebody who's interested in doing science communication is don't try to go about it in a cookie cutter way. Look at what your background has to offer, look at your strengths, and really lean into them because there really is room for everybody in this field.
What is your background, though? I know that you're saying not to follow a cookie cutter approach or follow exactly in your footsteps, but how did you get into this?
Yeah, I don't know if anybody could follow exactly my footsteps. I started in the sciences, and even before that, I was not one of those people who thought that I enjoyed science, who thought that I would be good at science. I kind of dealt with a lot of the sort of stereotyped and traditional issues that a lot of women deal with before they enter into a STEM career. A lot of stereotype threat, a lot of concerns about whether or not this was really for me. So it's not really the path I originally chose. I studied vocal jazz performance in school and switched over to psychology and did an undergraduate degree in psychology with a philosophy minor. But along the way, I did fall kind of madly in love with neuroscience. I had some great professors and some great research opportunities that opened my eyes up to neuropsychology and decided that I should continue on in my education because my undergraduate degree in psychology really didn't offer me the breadth of knowledge that I think I needed in basic neuroscience like systems, so I decided to get a master's degree in biology with a neuroscience concentration. And I ultimately did start a PhD in clinical neuropsychology. I grew up in Texas. I got both of my degrees in Texas, and I moved to New York to start a PhD. While I was there, I just was running into a lot of issues. I think my depression was getting to be quite overwhelming, and I wasn't really well managed while I lived in New York. I definitely wasn't taking medication, and I hadn't found a very good therapist. I was having a hard time sort of adjusting to the climate, adjusting to my new lab, adjusting to a lot of things. And I was coming out to Los Angeles on a regular basis because I was seeing somebody who lived out here. And I really fell in love with the city, and I decided it was time to take a break. So I left my PhD program. I came to Los Angeles with a full intention of establishing residency so that I could start school again and actually be able to afford it. But along the way, by random happenstance, I had some opportunities to guest on a couple of TV shows as sort of an expert guest. They needed somebody who could talk about neuroscience, or they needed somebody who could talk about the kind of work that I did. And it's like, oh, well, I can do that. So I did that, and I really enjoyed it, and I was somewhat successful at it. And through those first opportunities to sort of just be an expert guest, like a talking head, a lot of other television opportunities followed. And eventually I went from being the person who is being interviewed to becoming the person doing the interviewing. And what was meant to be just like this sort of fun experiment. It was always like, oh, I'll just do this until like I don't get any gigs anymore and then I'll go back to school. Really turned into, a decade-long career.
Well, you're still getting gigs, but if I'm not mistaken, didn't you start going back to school for something?
I did. I decided that it's been about a decade and I have been pretty consistently working in this field and really enjoyed it. I've branched out across different media platforms and I'm able to support myself and to live comfortably with the work that I do, which I never ever expected. And so because of that, I figured I'm in a pretty good position right now to be able to go back to school, to start a new PhD and not have to take out ludicrous student loans, because my PhD is in clinical psychology and it's more of, I guess, a practical or an applied degree, like becoming a lawyer, like becoming a doctor. Those types of degrees aren't generally covered by fellowships the way that a biology or a physics or a chemistry degree might be. And it can be quite expensive. So I've decided that now is the time to go back because I can actually afford to pay for it. Of course, that means I'm having to work quite hard at a lot of work-life school balance, and I'm getting into the swing of it. I'm giving and taking and trying to figure out my path, but I'm very excited to be back in kind of an academic environment.
How old were you when you fell in love with science?
Oh gosh. So, that's a hard question to answer because I think it has like a multimodal distribution. I did a project as a kindergartner that we had to make these paper dolls of ourselves and dress them up and say what they did. And my paper doll had an axe, a pickaxe, and a paintbrush, and a rope tied around her waist. And her name tag said, Dr. Santa Maria, paleontologist. So when I was really young, I was obsessed with dinosaurs, and I always wanted to do something.
But these were the scaly kind, right?
Yeah, back then it was. Back then there were no feathers on the dinosaurs, at least not that I remember. And I always knew I wanted to do something with dinosaurs, but I don't think make the connection that is science. And then, I went through school and I dealt with a lot of things that young girls deal with when they're going through school, which is not being motivated to do science, not being really called out or having special focus, special attention paid to them in the math and science fields, really being motivated to go a more literary or verbal track. And so I never thought I would be good at science. I always thought I was bad at math. It was really scary to me and overwhelming. And I really did avoid it straight through college. When I decided to major in psychology, it was required by my university that you take 3 science courses with a balance between life and physical sciences. And so I took the ones that I thought would be the easiest. I legit took in my college transcript, I have 3 classes: stellar astronomy, oceanography, and I want to say paleontology because that sounds more legitimate, but it was actually listed in the course guide as dinosaurs in all capital letters with an exclamation point at the end. So yes, one of my college science classes was dinosaurs.
That's amazing.
Yeah. And so I really didn't discover science and really fall in love until I took kind of physiological psychology courses that had a strong neuroscience emphasis in them, but it wasn't called neuroscience. It didn't have the word science attached to it. And so I slowly realized really in my junior and senior year of college that science was something that was interesting to me and that it was something that I could pursue in a real way. And then I went back and got my master's degree in the biology department with a neuroscience concentration.
Now, what has been your biggest motivation for studying this stuff? You mentioned that you had depression. Was that a key aspect in wanting to kind of understand how the brain works and how it ticks?
Honestly, I don't think so. Maybe I could say that in retrospect now, but the reason that I started a degree in psychology is because I thought it would be easy. I was a stoner in college. I was not really focusing on my academic work. I always liked to be challenged, and I loved my philosophy classes. I honestly probably would have majored in philosophy if I hadn't gotten a lot of pushback from people around me and from my parents saying that unless I wanted to get a PhD, I was kind of not going to have a real career prospect as a philosophy major. And so I think I just chose psychology because it offered me the most potential. I could maybe get a job as a social worker. I could maybe continue on in academia. Maybe I could go on to become a psychologist if I wanted to. Or through the active engaging in my coursework, I could figure out, some other option for me. Looking back, I'm sure that there was always some sort of below the conscious level of understanding interest in mental health, because I, of course, have struggled with mental health issues since I was a child. I've carried a diagnosis of major depressive disorder for a very long time. But that said, I actually was studying neuropsychology. I was much more interested in working with individuals with traumatic brain injury back then. And I was doing a lot of basic neuroscience research on mice. I wasn't really looking at people, and I definitely wasn't looking at mood disorders. That's changed a little bit. And now in my new focus on my clinical psych PhD, I'm very early in the process. So the caveat here is that I'm probably going to change my mind after I get experience and try a bunch of different hats on. But for the time being, I'm really, really fascinated by the life stage that is death and dying. I read a lot of books about the process of dying. I find people who are entering into that stage of their life to be incredibly thoughtful, incredibly warm, to have a really important perspective. I find them to be some of the most interesting people I've ever met. And that sort of career stage or phase is what I hope to be able to focus my efforts on in this new life chapter of mine.
Now, will that include near-death experiences?
I hadn't really thought about that, perhaps. But most people who have these quote-unquote near-death experiences aren't actually dying. They may have had a sudden accident where their brain was starved of oxygen for a period of time. Maybe they had a hypothermic event, or maybe they had a heart attack. I guess I'm more interested in people who know that they're dying and who have a long process ahead of them, people who are in oncology who know that they're experiencing a terminal diagnosis, or people who are elderly who have moved on into hospice care. Although that is an interesting concept, and it's something that I have covered journalistically in the past. There's some great kind of neuroscience explanations for the experiences that people have when they say that they're having a quote-unquote near-death experience.
I've broken this interview into 2 parts to make it easier to digest. Make sure that you go check out part 2. I'll put a link in the video description. Also, go check out her podcast, Talk Nerdy, and follow her at Cara Santa Maria on Twitter. And whatever you do, don't drink the Kool-Aid.